12 children were born into the same house between 1945 and 1968. 10 boys first, then 2 girls at last. On paper, they were a model Catholic family in a rising Colorado suburb. But in reality, 6 of those brothers would one day be marked by schizophrenia, while the other 6 siblings lived in constant fear of when or if their turn would come. Their home became less of a residence and more of an unlicensed asylum, a place of locked doors, shattered dishes, and silence. Within that silence, other harms took root. Abuse reframed as illness, secrets dismissed as symptoms. The files preserved dates and diagnoses, but not the dread that settled into every room. How can one house hold so much madness, yet remain hidden in plain sight? And why did an inherited illness consume half a family while sparing the rest? Before we go any further, I want to ask you, where are you watching from? And what hour is it over there right now? Leave your answer in the comments below. And while you are here with us, make sure you subscribe to X Archives so these accounts, sealed, buried, and almost forgotten, can be opened again. In the winter of 1983, in a locked records room of the Colorado State Hospital, a clerk cataloging old case files reached the back of an unlabeled cabinet. What he found was not a folder, but a manila envelope whose glue seam had never been broken. The paper was brittle, the corners yellowed, the ink on the cover faded almost to the color of bone. No label, no reference number, only the quiet weight of something long set aside. When the seal was lifted, the envelope revealed not pages of testimony but 12 index cards. Each bore a name, a date of birth, and a terse notation. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, without ornament. But the meaning lay not in what was written, but in how it was divided. 6 of the cards carried additional markings in red pencil, brief words, underlined once. 6 others bore none. On the reverse of each card were fragments, 2 or 3 words at most. Observation continues. Compliance partial. Intervention deferred. They read less like notes than code, the shorthand of an observer who chose not to explain. There was no narrative, no report, no diagnosis, only these scattered phrases. The records gave no clue as to who had drawn the line between the red-marked names and the unmarked, or why that division had been preserved so carefully. In institutional archives, omission is often louder than inclusion. A missing page, a broken chain of evidence, a gap where one ought not to be. Here, the silence was entire. The cards had been filed among unrelated patient histories, as if hidden deliberately or slipped in by accident. Their presence meant nothing unless someone already knew what to look for, and most did not. The envelope carried no author, the handwriting betrayed no urgency, yet the dates told their own story. From 1945 through 1968, all 12 births were tied to a single address. Each child had been catalogued as if already under watch. No explanation for the red marks was given, no clinical language beyond those fragments. The cards were not meant to explain. They were meant to endure, surviving quietly among decades of dust until the day someone opened the seal. To a casual clerk, the find might have been dismissed as clerical debris. But to those familiar with the hospital's long history, the meaning was unmistakable. This was not a record of patients, but of a family. 12 names bound to one household, half marked for loss before their lives had fully unfolded. There are records that explain themselves, and there are records that exist to remind us how much remains unsaid. This envelope belonged to the second category. It did not offer conclusions, only questions. Why 12? Why 6 in red? Why phrases so sparse they seemed intended to obscure rather than reveal? What the cards could not show was the place itself, the house where all 12 had lived. In 1963, on the northern edge of Colorado Springs, a new neighborhood spread across the foothills. Streets curved neatly, sidewalks gleamed, and the lawns stayed cut to uniform height. At its center stood a split-level house of pale brick and clean lines, facing west toward the newly built Air Force Academy. It was not a grand home, but it was solid, respectable, the kind of residence that suggested permanence. To neighbors, the house belonged to an exemplary family. Donald and Mimi Galvin appeared in parish bulletins and civic newsletters, praised as devoted Catholics and devoted parents. They hosted holidays, sent children to local schools, and presented themselves as the picture of mid-century stability. In a city that had grown quickly with military transfers and suburban expansion, the Galvins stood out for their rootedness. While others arrived and left, the family on Hidden Valley Road seemed immovable. Within those walls, 12 children were brought into the world between 1945 and 1968. 10 sons, then at last 2 daughters, each baptized, recorded, and celebrated as signs of providence. Large families were admired, even among the devout, but 12 was extraordinary. Strangers often marveled at the achievement. How could one household sustain such numbers and remain so composed? Mimi's sharp attention to detail supplied the answer. At Sunday Mass, each child was pressed into proper dress, hair neatly parted, shoes shined. Photographs from the era show them in rows, faces expectant, the very embodiment of Catholic discipline. The house itself seemed built for order. Its split-level design separated space into functions, kitchen and dining above, recreation and utility below, bedrooms aligned in disciplined rows. The walls were bright at first, the fixtures modern. From the curb, there was no visible strain. To the unknowing eye, it was simply another step in the post-war American dream. Yet beneath that surface, tension collected. Neighbors recalled noises from behind the brick facade. Not music or laughter, but sudden thuds, the crack of glass, then silence. Windows were quickly replaced, doors rehung, carpets scrubbed before anyone could ask questions. The Galvin children bore bruises that were explained away as rough play or sport. Outwardly, the facade remained intact, but the house was already a vessel for something unspoken. Over time, Hidden Valley Road became less a street address than a container for an unfolding history. The house absorbed what the records would later suggest, a pattern of instability that did not arrive all at once, but crept steadily through its occupants. To the community, it was a home filled with promise. To those inside, it was a structure of discipline pressed against forces they could neither name nor control. The story of the Galvins cannot be told through the brick walls or polished lawns alone. It lies in how the house functioned, shaped by the 2 figures who anchored it, a father who carried silence back from the war, and a mother who believed perfection could hold chaos at bay. Donald Galvin returned from the Pacific Campaign in 1945, not with medals on display, but with silence. He had seen combat in the final stages of the war, the brutal island fighting where exhaustion blurred into fear. The records of his service mention repeated hospitalizations for attacks of nerves, a phrase used before the modern language of trauma. Today, it would be recognized as post-traumatic stress. At the time, it was left unnamed. Back in Colorado, Donald did not rage, nor did he drink. He withdrew. His presence was felt through commands, not conversation. His children rarely recalled him speaking at length, only issuing instructions in the clipped manner of a man accustomed to discipline. The house moved according to his direction, but never around his affection. When the U.S. Air Force was established, Donald transferred into its ranks and later took a teaching position at the academy. From the outside, this was a distinguished career, one that explained the family's stability and status in the growing city. But within the home, his role was less a father than a commander. He measured children by compliance, not by need. To him, names seemed less important than numbers. 4. Line up. 6. Clean that. His sons responded to numerical assignments as though they were troops in formation. Correction did not come through dialogue, but through gloves. He issued boxing equipment to the boys, insisting they settle disputes with fists under supervision. Broken noses and bruises were not evidence of failure. They were treated as exercises in toughness. This militarized rhythm shaped the household. Rules were clear, deviations corrected without hesitation. But what was absent carried more weight. There were no long talks, no moments of tenderness, no encouragement beyond the order of function. The father who might have spoken of dreams or doubts remained silent. He lived in the house, but the children grew under a canopy of distance. For the sons, this form of guidance carried into adolescence. Aggression became normalized, conflict was expected, and silence was never broken by questions of feeling. For the daughters born later, the father's absence was even more pronounced. They grew up not with a protector or confidant, but with a figure who was there physically, yet unreachable. Neighbors saw little of this. Donald's exterior matched the image of a disciplined officer, a man who kept his property tidy, his children in order, his wife composed. Inside, however, his silence left space that others filled. Without warmth from him, structure became the substitute. Without conversation, routine was the language of survival. The father set the frame, but it was the mother who filled it. Into the silence he left behind, Mimi Galvin wove her own kind of order. An order pressed into linens, into polished shoes, into the image of a flawless Catholic household. Where his distance removed softness, her discipline supplied surface perfection. If Donald Galvin's silence set the frame of the household, it was Mimi who filled it. She was not content to let chance dictate the shape of her family. Instead, she believed order itself could be the answer, that perfection was a discipline strong enough to contain what threatened to spill through the walls. Her devotion to Catholic ideals was unswerving. A large family was not only acceptable, it was proof of virtue. 12 children meant abundance, service, and faith made visible in the parish. She held fast to the belief that structure could ward off disorder, that ritual could bind a home together. Meals were prepared with care, every place setting identical, every napkin pressed to a sharp fold. Floors were scrubbed until they gleamed, curtains laundered until they hung without crease. The children were presented not as individuals but as extensions of her discipline. Each Sunday they appeared at Mass in polished shoes, shirts crisp, hair parted neatly down the middle. Neighbors saw no trace of hardship. Instead, they saw achievement, a mother capable of raising 12 without losing composure. To the community, Mimi embodied control, the matriarch whose diligence could withstand the pressure of numbers. Inside the house, her methods carried the force of ritual. Beds were remade if corners sagged. Shoes were repolished if they bore scuffs. Order was not suggestion, it was law. Small deviations invited lectures that stretched beyond the infraction itself. The children learned that precision mattered more than comfort, that appearance outweighed confession. Their mother's authority was less about warmth than about standard. Yet beneath this surface, strain gathered. Order functioned as a mask, not a cure. The moments of unrest, the shouting, the broken glass, the long silences, were pressed down with greater discipline. Where others might have admitted weakness, Mimi doubled the polish. Where others might have acknowledged fracture, she tightened the rules. To visitors, the family shone. To those inside, the shine only emphasized what could not be acknowledged. Over time, her perfectionism became both shield and denial. She scrubbed not only stains but signs. A crack in the wall was repaired before it could be read as damage. A tear in fabric was mended before anyone could see it fray. She made the home immaculate, not because it was whole, but because it was not. In this way, she passed her expectations into her children. They were taught to meet the world in pressed collars and polished shoes, to stand as evidence that nothing within the house could be questioned. Her order became their armor, but armor cannot prevent what rises from within. The firstborn, Donald Jr., seemed to embody her achievement. Strong, disciplined, admired in school and on the field, he was proof that structure could produce excellence. Yet even as he stood as the model son, shadows had begun to surface. Shadows that order could not conceal and discipline could not restrain. To the outside world, Donald Galvin Jr. was the kind of son any family might hold up as proof of success. He was disciplined in school, reliable on the field, admired by coaches and teachers alike. In football and wrestling, he stood out not only for strength, but for the precision of his movements, a controlled intensity that seemed to confirm the value of his parents' discipline. His peers saw him as confident, even commanding. At Colorado State University, his professors noted the same qualities: focused, capable, rarely careless. But underneath that image, small fissures were already visible. At family dinners, he sometimes sat staring across the table without speaking, his food untouched. He would vanish into silence for hours after what seemed a trivial disagreement. These lapses were brushed off as moodiness, the kind expected of an adolescent boy, but they were early signs of something more enduring. By his late teens, more troubling incidents surfaced. At a university bonfire, he suddenly leapt into the flames without warning. He emerged burned but smiling, offering no explanation. His laughter dissolved into silence, leaving those around him unsettled. A few months later, his roommate found a box hidden beneath the dormitory sink. Inside lay the remains of a cat, strangled and discarded. When questioned, Donald Jr. dismissed it without detail. It was treated as an odd lapse, nothing more. No formal report was filed, no intervention pursued. Each event might have drawn attention had it occurred in isolation. Together they formed a pattern, yet the pattern was never named. Coaches explained his volatility as competitive spirit. Professors attributed his absences to stress. Even when he presented at the university health office, reporting difficulty connecting with other people, he was returned to class without psychiatric referral. His words, "A barrier between and myself and others," were written down, then forgotten. At home, his behavior became stranger still. One winter, he removed all the living room furniture, placing each item carefully in the backyard without explanation. Another time, he poured salt into the family aquarium, killing the fish. His parents dismissed these as signs of marital strain or youthful frustration. To them, he was still the firstborn, the son who embodied structure and achievement. To admit otherwise was to admit disorder in the house itself. The fractures widened as his marriage faltered. He grew withdrawn, then unpredictable. His silences lengthened, punctuated by sudden bursts of destruction. In one episode, he shattered dishes one by one at the kitchen sink, pausing between each as if following a ritual no one else could see. The family endured it in silence, explaining it away as stress. The language of illness was avoided. What mattered most was that nothing outside the walls could suggest failure. But silence cannot hold forever. Donald Jr.'s unraveling would soon reach beyond bruises and broken glass. His wife became the first direct target of his delusions, forced into an act that brought police, arrest, and at last, a diagnosis. The fracture that had long been ignored finally forced its way into record in the winter of Donald Jr.'s young adulthood. What began as silence, blank stares, and scattered outbursts escalated into an act that could no longer be explained away as stress or youthful volatility. In the early hours of one morning, his wife awoke to the bitter sting of chemical fumes. Donald Jr. had rigged a setup in their home, forcing her to inhale vapors that investigators later confirmed as cyanide. She struggled, escaped, and raised the alarm. Police arrived to find her shaken, the air still tinged with acrid residue. For the first time, an event within the family crossed the threshold from private disturbance to public crime. The arrest was swift. Reports described him as calm, detached, even when confronted with the gravity of his actions. He offered no coherent explanation, only fragments of thought, delivered without urgency. It was during his confinement in Pueblo's Colorado State Hospital that the first formal evaluation was conducted. Case notes from the period describe flattened affect, paranoid ideation, and a consistent disconnection from shared reality. The diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia, was entered into his file. For his parents, the word was as much a rupture as the act itself. To acknowledge schizophrenia was to name something they had resisted for years. Within the household, the term was treated with caution, almost as if saying it aloud might allow it to spread further. Mimi referred to her eldest son as simply going through something. Donald Sr. remained largely silent, attending hearings but offering no commentary. Yet the label, once given, could not be erased. It sat in the file, stamped and dated, the first official recognition of an illness that had been seeping through the family long before authorities arrived. The diagnosis brought no closure. Treatment Ent began with medication, strict supervision, and confinement, but it did not resolve the unease. The family now carried the burden of both secrecy and official record. What had been explained away in private as eccentricity or aggression was now categorized, classified, and entered into the system. And with it came an unspoken question. Was Donald Jr. an exception, or was he the first sign of something larger? At home, the siblings felt the shift. They had witnessed his rages, his silences, the sudden destruction of furniture, the inexplicable cruelty to animals. Now they saw him institutionalized, his behavior confirmed as illness, not mere anger. Some were relieved to have words for what they had endured. Others grew fearful, sensing in themselves the same blankness, the same odd impulses waiting to emerge. The household could no longer claim innocence through appearance. A line had been crossed. The firstborn, once the proof of order, now marked in red. And as the family adjusted to his absence, the signs began to stir in others. The first diagnosis had been given. It would not be the last. One by one, brothers would follow, each bearing different symptoms but the same root affliction. What had seemed isolated in Donald Jr. was only the beginning of a cascade. The first diagnosis did not stand alone. Once Donald Jr. had been marked, the pattern revealed itself again and again, each repetition both familiar and distinct. His brothers followed, not in unison, but in sequence, their unraveling forming a chorus rather than a single voice. James, the second-born, managed for a time to maintain the appearance of stability. He married, fathered a child, and worked steadily. Yet beneath that surface, he was pursued by voices, whispers of conspiracies, unseen observers. Alcohol became his refuge, but also his accelerant. His violence turned inward on his family, accusations of betrayal, assaults, and episodes of terrifying unpredictability. Later testimony from his sisters revealed another secret, abuse that unfolded in the shadows of his psychosis, concealed by the family's silence. James lived longer than some of his brothers, but his life was marked by fear both inflicted and endured. Brian seemed more outwardly functional. He left Colorado, lived in California, and entered a relationship that promised a fresh path. But his illness followed him quietly, masked behind charm and apparent composure. When that relationship fractured, he collapsed entirely. One night, he shot his former partner and then himself. The act, classified in police reports as murder-suicide, closed his life violently, leaving the family with another wound they did not name publicly. Like James, Brian too had carried hidden abuse into the lives of his sisters. His death silenced his violence but did not erase its memory. Matthew's break came after a head injury inflicted by his brother Joseph during a violent episode. Following neurosurgery, he drifted into delusional identity. He insisted he was Paul McCartney, claiming authorship of songs he could not sing. His episodes carried a surreal quality, undressing in front of guests, smashing his own creations. Less violent than his brothers, but no less fractured, his illness stripped him not of coherence alone, but of self. Peter collapsed early, in adolescence. Teachers once praised his brilliance in mathematics and his skill in hockey, but by 14 he was wetting himself uncontrollably, convinced the devil lived beneath the house. Medications cycled without effect. He endured electroconvulsive therapy ordered by the court, leaving him dulled, heavily sedated, a shadow of the boy who had once excelled. His life became a long surrender, his body moving through routines while his mind remained trapped by voices he could never quiet. Joseph, among the younger sons, experienced visions of uncanny clarity. He saw emperors in clouds, conversed with voices he knew were not real, and lived with the torment of awareness. Unlike his brothers, he recognized his delusions as false, yet he could not escape them. He retained kindness, sending birthday cards, speaking with regret, but his awareness brought no peace. He became a man both fractured and lucid, crushed by the knowledge of his own decline. Together, their stories formed not isolated cases, but a sequence. One brother institutionalized, another violent, another delusional, another sedated, another tormented by visions. Their symptoms differed, but their roots converged. The illness did not strike randomly. It moved through the family with a rhythm that spared some and consumed others. By the late 1970s, the Galvin home could no longer be described as a residence. It had become something else, a place where psychosis was not only present but managed daily. The house itself had transformed, no longer the ideal brick split level of suburban promise, but a structure adapted to contain the madness that lived within. By the close of the 1970s, the Galvin home had ceased to function as a conventional household. On paper, it remained a suburban residence, split-level, pale brick, facing the foothills. In practice, it had become something else entirely, an improvised ward, unlicensed and unseen, where 6 brothers cycled through psychosis under the supervision of their mother and the silence of their father. The signs were everywhere, though none lasted long enough for outsiders to glimpse. Chairs overturned and splintered against the walls. Dishes shattered methodically, one by one, then swept into bags before dawn. Windows smashed with bare hands, blood staining the curtains, then scrubbed away before morning mass. Every surface bore evidence of collapse, but every mark was erased quickly, as if cleanliness could conceal memory. Neighbors noticed little. The lawn remained cut, the shutters painted, the driveway swept. The Galvin address carried no hint of what officers and paramedics saw when they stepped quietly inside. Police calls became routine, logged but rarely spoken of. Officers who knew the address learned to arrive without sirens, aware that escalation only worsened the storm. They entered quietly, restrained as needed, left without reports that might reach the wider community. Inside, medication became the only thin barrier between calm and crisis. Bottles of antipsychotics lined cupboards, labels faded, doses shifted without physician oversight. Sometimes pills were withheld before family gatherings to make a son appear more alert. Other times, extra doses were given to subdue agitation before it could spill into violence. Compliance was monitored by memory rather than chart, adjusted in real time by a mother who believed endurance was a form of devotion. The rhythm of the household shifted to crisis management. Nights were punctuated by screams that lasted hours, by sudden destruction of furniture, by violent outbursts that ended with exhaustion rather than resolution. Blood was cleaned, glass vacuumed from carpets, doors replaced, all before dawn's light could expose the truth. Each episode left its trace, not in permanent records, but in the wear of walls, the dents of floors, the quiet of children taught not to speak of what they saw. To an outsider, the Galvin residence still looked like a family home, its 12 occupants gathered under one roof. To those within, it resembled a closed unit, each room assigned not by comfort but by necessity. Locked doors separated the unstable from the vulnerable. Meals were delivered like rations to those sedated in their bedrooms. The youngest children learned to move through corridors as if they were wards in a facility, avoiding eye contact, slipping silently past doors that rattled with fists from the other side. In such a place, childhood ceased to exist in the ordinary sense. The daughters, Margaret and Lindsay, entered this environment not as carefree children, but as witnesses. They were too young to be patients, too overlooked to be protected, and too disciplined to be allowed fear. For them, survival meant silence, and silence would become the only inheritance left to them from the house that had become its own asylum. By the time Margaret and Lindsay were born, the house on Hidden Valley Road was no longer a place of aspiration. It was already burdened, its routines shaped by breakdowns, its walls scarred by years of violence and silence. The 2 girls entered last, the 11th and 12th children in a family where 10 brothers had already absorbed most of the space, both physical and emotional. They were not struck openly by their parents. There was no hand raised against them in the ordinary sense. Their harm came differently, by being placed in a structure already saturated with unrest, expected to function within rules that allowed no acknowledgement of fear. Childhood for them was not a progression of play and discovery, but a series of watchful retreats. From their earliest memories, the signs of collapse were visible. Furniture dragged into yards without reason, sudden shouting behind closed doors, plates shattered in sequence until the floor glittered with shards. The girls learned quickly what others had already accepted. When voices rose, when footsteps grew too heavy, the safest place was behind a locked door. They crouched together in their mother's bedroom or their own, clutching the knob as though the lock itself could hold back the disorder outside. The household taught them to watch. Margaret, the elder, became hyper-vigilant, attuned to changes in tone, to silences that carried weight. She learned to anticipate which brother was about to spiral, which hallway to avoid, when to disappear into stillness. Lindsay, youngest of all, grew up with no memory of a time before crisis. Her earliest recollections included watching her eldest brother stand naked in doorways, unmoving, or seeing entire rooms emptied of furniture overnight. To her, strangeness was not a departure from normal. It was the baseline. Silence became their safeguard. They asked no questions of their parents, and their parents offered no explanations in return. The girls were dressed carefully for church, presented as the final touch of Mimi's order, but once home they withdrew again into the corners of a house that no longer felt like theirs. They were witnesses to events no one named, and the witnessing itself became its own kind of burden. The scars of those years were not visible in photographs. Pictures showed 12 children lined up neatly, their mother composed, their father silent but steady. Behind the images, the girls had already been trained to carry composure as armor. They did not speak of fear. They did not seek comfort. They learned instead to endure quietly, to function within a family where survival depended on restraint. But silence is not a shield against everything. It can protect from questions, from neighbors, from the embarrassment of exposure. It cannot protect against what grows inside the spaces left unspoken. Within that silence, other forms of harm flourished, concealed, excused, and reframed as illness. For Margaret and Lindsay, the locked doors were only temporary shelters. What they hid from was not only psychosis, but predation. The next chapter of their lives would reveal that silence had not merely concealed madness, it had also concealed crimes. The silence that governed the Galvin home did more than shield appearances. It created conditions where harm could root itself and remain unchallenged. Psychosis became the explanation for every disturbance, the ready-made language that excused violence and deflected questions. Within that frame, abuse flourished. Margaret was the first to endure it. In early adolescence, she was assaulted by Brian, then later by James, both already exhibiting symptoms of schizophrenia. To them, delusion and predation overlapped, and the line between illness and intent blurred. To her, it was violation without recourse. When she disclosed it years later, her mother did not deny it, but reframed it. They were ill, they did not know what they were doing. The assaults were not treated as crimes, but as unfortunate symptoms, collateral damage of madness. Lindsay, the youngest, was drawn into the same pattern. Left in the care of James during volatile episodes, she was watched, touched, and told afterward that nothing had happened. The message was consistent. Silence must prevail. If she felt violated, it was to be interpreted as confusion, not truth. She internalized this, retreating further, her escape coming only years later when a boarding school scholarship removed her from the house. But by then, the harm was done, and its imprint carried forward into every relationship that followed. Joseph, one of the younger brothers, revealed in adulthood that he too had been abused, not by a sibling, but by a Catholic priest trusted by the family. The priest had long been a presence in their lives, welcomed during absences when Donald Sr. was away and Mimi overwhelmed. Joseph described the familiar sequence: kindness, special attention, private lessons under the guise of guidance, followed by exploitation. He told his mother years later, but by then the priest had retired. Mimi did not report it, choosing again to place endurance above exposure. The pattern did not end with one generation. Mimi herself later disclosed, almost incidentally, that she had been molested by her stepfather as a child. She offered this not as confession but as explanation, as if to justify her own capacity to survive, and therefore the expectation that her daughters should do the same. In that moment, a chain revealed itself. 3 generations linked not only by trauma, but by silence. Religion provided cover rather than confrontation. Faith was invoked as forgiveness, priests regarded as moral authorities immune from suspicion, and family loyalty demanded discretion above all else. The abuse, whether by brother or by cleric, was folded into the broader narrative of illness. What might have been named as criminal was dismissed as symptomatic, and so it continued, unspoken, unreported, unresolved. In the record, schizophrenia dominates the narrative of the Galvins, but beneath it runs another current, the quiet knowledge that madness was not the only legacy within those walls. For Margaret and Lindsay, survival meant carrying secrets they had not chosen. For Joseph, it meant reconciling visions no medication could erase with memories no priest ever confessed. The illnesses consumed half the brothers, but the others, John, Mark, Michael, Richard, remained outwardly untouched. They escaped the diagnosis, yet carried another burden, the fear that it might still come for them, and the guilt of being spared when so many others were not. Not every Galvin son was overtaken by psychosis. 4 brothers, John, Mark, Michael, and Richard, lived without a formal diagnosis, outwardly functional, their lives appearing stable in comparison to the others, yet survival did not mean freedom. For them, the absence of illness was not an escape but a constant shadow. John was the first to remove himself. Watching his older brothers unravel, he interpreted every violent outburst as a preview of his own possible future. Rather than wait for confirmation, he left Colorado, settling in Idaho with his wife and taking work as a music teacher. He cited logistics and distance as reasons for rare visits, but in truth, it was vigilance, a belief that only miles could protect him. He never received treatment, never carried a diagnosis, but his life was shaped entirely by avoidance. Michael's path was different. Twice admitted for observation as a teenager, he was briefly prescribed antipsychotic medication after exhibiting early warning signs. Fleeting paranoia, perceptual disturbances. He refused to accept the label, discontinuing treatment against medical advice. Instead, he turned inward, relying on meditation and self-discipline to steady himself. He lived with the quiet fear that symptoms could return, and every moment of disorientation was measured carefully, catalogued as potential evidence. For him, wellness meant constant monitoring. Richard sought refuge in control of another kind. He became a mining investor in Denver, drawn to the precision of numbers and the predictability of financial systems. In interviews, colleagues noted his discomfort in unstructured situations, his rigidity in routine, his reluctance to deviate. He carried no diagnosis, but his behaviors reflected adaptation to chaos. A man who built his own insulated order in response to a childhood that had none. Mark carried the heaviest burden of comms, Parison. Once a promising hockey player, he had trained and competed alongside brothers whose athletic potential vanished under the weight of illness. He lived each year expecting the same collapse. Even in health, he described himself as a man holding a door shut, uncertain what pressed against it on the other side. He never manifested schizophrenia, but the fear of it remained constant. For these 4, survival was marked by guilt. Why them and not the others? The onset of schizophrenia typically occurs in early adulthood, and each passed through those years in vigilance, scanning themselves for signs, a lapse in concentration, a slip in memory, a shift in mood. None were ever claimed by the illness, yet each lived as though it might still arrive. In research records, they are described as unaffected carriers, useful to genetic studies for contrast against their ill siblings. In lived reality, they bore the psychological weight of being spared. Unaffected was never the same as untouched. Their futures were bent not by diagnosis, but by fear. And while the brothers carried vigilance into their adult lives, the house itself remained bound by a different figure. If Donald Sr. had withdrawn into silence, it was Mimi who maintained the illusion, cleaning, concealing, and enduring. Her determination to preserve order defined how the family functioned day to day. If Donald Galvin's silence framed the household, Mimi's labor filled every gap. She became not only a mother of 12, but the custodian of appearances, convinced that order itself could withstand disorder. When chairs splintered against walls, she swept away the fragments before neighbors could ask questions. When windows shattered, she rehung curtains to conceal the absence of glass until replacements could arrive. Blood stains on carpets and plaster were scrubbed before morning light, her work invisible by design. For Mimi, concealment was not neglect, but duty. She resisted the recommendations of physicians who suggested long-term institutionalization for her sons. To hand them over to hospitals, she believed, would be a failure of motherhood. Better to endure the chaos within her walls than to allow the world to see. Endurance, in her eyes, was the highest form of devotion. This instinct was shaped long before she had children. In adulthood, she revealed almost casually that she had been molested by her stepfather. She presented it not as a wound, but as explanation. She had survived without intervention and therefore believed her own children could survive by endurance as well. Her trauma, untreated and unspoken for decades, hardened into a model, a belief that silence was strength and exposure was weakness. Her perfectionism supplied the surface to support this belief. At church and in public, she appeared immaculate, her children polished and composed. Photographs from the period show her as the archetype of a Catholic mother, hair arranged, posture poised, each child pressed into neat formation beside her. What these images concealed were the hours spent patching upholstery, covering holes in walls, locking doors to contain breakdowns. Every act of order was also an act of concealment, each napkin ironed to a sharp fold, another card in a fragile construction. Professionals at the time occasionally labeled her a schizophrenogenic mother, a now discredited theory suggesting that cold, over-controlling mothers caused schizophrenia in their children. The label was both inaccurate and cruel, yet her emotional distance and obsessive discipline made her a convenient target for mischaracterization. The truth was more complex. She did not cause her children's illness, but her determination to manage it in silence delayed recognition, obstructed intervention, and perpetuated the harm endured by the rest of the family. Her house functioned like a stage set, flawless from the front, shored up behind the curtain. To neighbors, the family was admirable. 12 children, military honor, Catholic devotion. Behind drawn curtains, it was a structure of containment where her labor never ceased. By day, she preserved the image of stability. By night, she scrubbed, patched, locked, and prayed that no one would look too closely. Mimi lived with the constant knowledge that one misstep, a police report made public, a neighbor who looked too long, an inquiry from the parish, could unravel everything she had built. She maintained her house as carefully as a ledger, every entry balanced, every irregularity hidden. Her order was both shield and prison. But concealment cannot last forever. While she guarded appearances, science was preparing to look beyond them. In the early 1980s, researchers drew blood from her children, preserving samples that would outlive her discipline. What Mimi had hidden within walls, others would one day search for in the code of their genes. By the early 1980s, the Galvin family had already drawn the attention of psychiatrists. 6 sons carried diagnoses of schizophrenia, 6 did not. For researchers searching for patterns in heredity, this concentration was extraordinary, a living case study that could not be ignored. Blood was drawn quietly, vials labeled not with names but with codes. The samples were cataloged and shipped into long-term storage, frozen in laboratory freezers where they would remain for decades. At the time, genetic tools were crude. Chromosomal karyotyping could identify large abnormalities, but finer details remained invisible. No single marker could be found to explain why some Galvins unraveled and others did not. The samples waited. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, psychiatric research shifted, advanced, then circled back to families like the Galvins. By 2016, with whole genome sequencing and high-capacity data analysis, scientists returned to those vials. What they sought was not a simple cause, but patterns, anomalies that repeated across affected siblings. Among the millions of data points, One mutation appeared consistently, a variation in the SHANK2 gene responsible for a protein that stabilizes synapses, the connections through which neurons communicate. A disruption here could weaken signaling, alter pathways of perception, cognition, and emotional regulation. It was the kind of finding that offered a foothold, a place where molecular biology intersected with lived pathology. Every Galvin sibling who had provided a sample carried the mutation. 7 diagnosed brothers bore it. The connection was clear, but not complete. The 4 brothers who had never shown symptoms carried it as well. Healthy and ill shared the same altered blueprint. What differed was not sequence, but expression. Why some succumbed while others endured remained unanswered. Theories multiplied. Perhaps early stress triggered it into action. Perhaps viral exposure, head trauma, or a second hidden mutation was needed to unlock its effects. Science offered possibilities but no certainty. The SHANK2 mutation became not a verdict but a pathway. A marker that confirmed madness could be traced into the double helix, but not predicted, not prevented. For the Galvins, this revelation arrived too late to alter lives already defined by the illness. Blood taken decades earlier had yielded clues, but no cure. There was no pill to correct a protein, no intervention to switch the gene off. The samples had preserved evidence, not solutions. In laboratories, the Galvin name appeared anonymized, reduced to case numbers and datasets. In their home, however, the reality of schizophrenia was never abstract. The illness lived in broken doors, in hospital wards, in lives cut short or reshaped entirely. What science could map in strands of DNA, the family had already endured in silence and survival. The blood carried a mutation. The house carried the cost. And as researchers published their findings, the Galvin family entered medical history not as an exception, but as a reminder. Genes reveal risks, not fates. By then, decades had passed. Parents had died, brothers institutionalized, others buried, survivors scattered into lives haunted by memory. The laboratory offered pathways, but the residue of madness remained in lived reality in the years that followed when the story of the Galvins did not end but fractured further. By the early 2000s, the Galvin family no longer resembled the dozen faces once lined up neatly for photographs. Parents were gone, brothers scattered, some institutionalized, others buried. The household that had contained so much disorder had emptied, leaving behind records in hospital archives and graves in Colorado soil. James, the second-born, died in 2001. His body yielded quietly to heart failure, a death attributed not only to age, but to the cumulative toll of long-term antipsychotic medication. For decades, his presence had been volatile, his voice filled with accusation, his hands quick to strike. In the end, he slipped into silence, his death marked in a coroner's file, reduced to cause and effect. Peter lasted longer, once praised for his brilliance in mathematics, once skated across ice with discipline and promise. He had been undone by visions that began in adolescence. Heavy sedation had dulled his movements for years, rendering him more patient than participant. In 2023, his life ended without spectacle. No violent episode, no police report, only the quiet record of a man who had ceased in his sleep. Donald Jr. and Matthew remained institutionalized, living in managed care as long-term residents. Their conditions were no longer treated with hope of recovery, only with maintenance. Files updated occasionally with medication adjustments and behavioral notes were all that remained of men who once embodied potential. Their existence was reduced to charts in a ward, their identities dissolved into patient numbers. The surviving siblings drifted outward, some attempting distance, others tethered by guilt. John in Idaho, Richard in Denver, Mark still waiting for the first symptom that never came. Michael credited meditation with keeping him whole, though even his stability carried a tremor of doubt. Margaret and Lindsay, the sisters who had borne witness to everything, carried scars invisible to record. Their traumas were not coded in medical charts, yet shaped every relationship and every silence in their adult lives. Donald Sr. had died in 2003, Mimi in 2017. Their headstones, side by side, gave no hint of the chaos they had overseen. No epitaph could capture the endurance or the concealment that defined Mimi's role, nor the silence that marked Donald's. Together, they were remembered in the quiet way communities remember those who seemed respectable. The history of what had lived inside their house remained largely unspoken, preserved more in scientific papers and testimonies than in eulogies. For clinicians and researchers, the Galvins became case numbers in journals, examples of heredity mapped into psychiatric disorder. For neighbors, they were the family that had once seemed so admirable, their house repainted, resold, its walls no longer bearing their name, but for those who had lived it, memory persisted. Of locked doors, of nights crouched in silence, of brothers lost not in death alone, but in madness that had consumed them long before. Official records can classify, reduce, and close a file, but no chart can contain the sound of breaking glass, the smell of scrubbed carpets, or the dread of waiting for footsteps to pass. The Galvin family survived in fragments, scattered across geography and memory, but their home remained fixed. Hidden Valley Road still stood, its pale brick altered, its rooms renovated, yet carrying the invisible weight of what had unfolded within. The house on Hidden Valley Road still stands. Its pale brick has been repainted, its shutters replaced, its floors refinished. Over the years, it has changed owners more than once. Families have moved in, unaware or only dimly aware of what had lived there before them. Children have played in its yard. Curtains have been hung in its windows, dinners eaten in the dining room. On the surface, it is another suburban home, its history reduced to property records and transactions. But houses remember in ways that paper cannot. The walls once held the sound of plates shattering, of fists against doors, of voices fractured by delusion. The carpets once bore stains scrubbed away before morning light. Bedrooms once functioned as cells, locks turned not to secure belongings, but to secure safety. Even if no mark remains visible, the weight of what occurred does not leave so easily. For researchers, the Galvins are a case study, one of the most concentrated examples of schizophrenia within a single family ever documented. 6 brothers diagnosed, each with their own variation of madness: paranoid, disorganized, delusional, resistant. 6 others outwardly spared, yet living in the shadow of fear and silence. Blood drawn, frozen, and sequenced decades later, revealing the SHANK2 mutation, but offering no final verdict. A blueprint, but not an explanation. For those who lived inside the house, the memory is not abstract. Margaret and Lindsay, the youngest, remember locks and silence, their childhoods marked by survival rather than play. John remembers distance as his only safeguard. Mark remembers waiting for symptoms that never arrived. Michael remembers measuring every thought against the fear of collapse. Richard remembers insulating himself in work and routine. Each carried forward something the records cannot measure: the quiet toll of being spared, but never free. The Galvin story does not close neatly. It has been told in books, in documentaries, in scientific journals, but no narrative fully explains why this family, why this house. The questions remain suspended. Why did the illness consume 6 and not the others? Why did silence allow abuse to root itself across generations? Why did science provide pathways but not answers? Hidden Valley Road itself has become more than an address. It is a reminder of how easily a home can become an institution without official recognition, how appearances can shield disorder, and how heredity can carry both prophecy and uncertainty. Its current occupants may repaint the walls, replace the floors, and fill its rooms with new laughter, but the history remains lodged beneath the surface, a weight that cannot be stripped away with fresh plaster. 6 names marked in red, 6 spared, but never released from its shadow. A family measured, dissected, and archived, yet never understood in full. The Galvins remain both a warning and a question. A reminder that illness does not simply visit. It can take residence, binding itself to blood, to silence, to place. And the question lingers still, unanswered. Why them? Make sure you like this video and subscribe to X Archives so these stories, sealed, buried, and almost forgotten, can be opened again.